Chapter 51. The Officer. In the meantime, the cardinal was expecting news from England, but as no news arrived, excepting such as was vexatious and alarming, La Rochelle was formally invested. However, certain success appeared, thanks to the precautions which had been taken, and more especially to the mole which no longer permitted any vessel to approach the besieged town. The blockade might yet continue a long time, and it was a great affront to the arms of the king and a great annoyance to the cardinal, who had no longer, it is true, to embroil Louis XIII with Anne of Austria, for that had been accomplished, but to reconcile Monsieur de Bassompierre, who had quarreled with the Duke of Angoulême. The town, in spite of the incredible persistence of its mayor, had attempted a sort of mutiny in order to surrender, but the mayor had sent the mutineers to be hung. This execution subdued the most unruly, who were thereby determined to submit, in preference to death from starvation, as the latter mode of dying appeared to them less certain and more slow than that of strangulation. The besiegers, on their side, occasionally captured some of the messengers whom the Rochelle dispatched to Buckingham, or the spies whom Buckingham had sent to the Rochelle. In both cases, the captives were subjected to a summary trial. The cardinal pronounced the single word, hung. His Majesty was invited to the execution. The king came languidly and chose a good place for observing all the details of the operation. This amused him for a time and gave him a little patience with the siege, but it did not prevent him from becoming heartily weary, or from talking incessantly of returning to Paris, so that if the messengers or spies had fallen short, His Eminence, in spite of all his fertility of imagination, would have found himself in very considerable embarrassment. Nevertheless, the time passed away, and still the Rochelle did not surrender. The last spy who had been captured was the bearer of a letter, which informed Buckingham that the town was at the last extremity, but instead of adding, if your assistance should not arrive before a fortnight, we must surrender, it merely said, if your assistance should not arrive before a fortnight, we shall be all dead from hunger when it does arrive. The Rochelle, therefore, had no hope but in Buckingham. Buckingham was their Messiah. It was manifest that, if they should receive indubitable information that no further dependence was to be placed on Buckingham, their courage would forsake them along with their hope. The cardinal, on this account, waited with extreme impatience for intelligence from England, which might announce to him that Buckingham would not arrive. The question of taking the town by assault, which had been often debated in the king's council, had been always dismissed. In the first instance, La Rochelle appeared to be impregnable, and then the cardinal, whatever he might himself have said about it aloud, was well aware that the horror of the blood, which would have been shed in such an encounter where Frenchmen fought against Frenchmen, would have been a retrogression of 60 years imprinted on his policy, and that the cardinal was, at that epoch, what we now call a man of progress. In fact, the sack of La Rochelle and the slaughter of 3,000 or 4,000 Huguenots, who would have perished, would have had, in 1628, too great a resemblance to the massacre of St. Bartholomew in 1572. Finally, in addition to all of this extreme measure, to which His Majesty, like a good Catholic, had no repugnance, always broke down before this argument of the besieging generals: La Rochelle is impregnable except by famine. The cardinal was unable to dismiss from his own mind the fear which he entertained of his terrible emissary, for he had also understood the strange characteristics of that woman, who was half lioness and half serpent. Had she betrayed him, or was she dead? He knew her well enough in any case to be assured that whether she was acting for him or against him, whether enemy or friend, she could not remain inactive without very powerful obstructions. But whence could these obstructions arise? This was what he was unable to define. After all, however, he had, with good reason, much confidence in her ladyship. He had suspected in her past career circumstances so terrible that his own red mantle was required to conceal them, and he felt that, from some cause or other, this woman was his own, because from him alone could she obtain support more potent than the danger which pursued her. The cardinal resolved, therefore, to conduct the war alone, and to expect aid foreign to himself only as one may expect the coincidence of a fortunate chance. He continued the construction of that famous embankment which was to carry famine into La Rochelle, and in the meantime he cast his eyes over that unhappy city, which contained so much profound misery and so many heroic virtues, recalling to his mind the expression of Louis XI, who had been his own political predecessor, as he himself was the predecessor of Robespierre, and adopting this maxim of the companion of Tristan, divide to govern. When Henry IV besieged Paris, he had thrown over the walls bread and other edibles. The cardinal threw over brief addresses in which he represented to the Rochellois how unjust and self-willed and barbarous had been the conduct of their chiefs, who possessed abundance of wheat yet did not distribute it, and who adopted as a maxim, for they had also their maxims, that the death of women, of old men, and of children was a thing of little moment, so that the men who were to defend the walls continued vigorous and well. Until then, either from devotion or from inability to contend against it, this maxim had, without being generally adopted, passed from theory into practice, but these addresses successfully assailed it. They remained the men that these women, children, and old men who were allowed to die of hunger were their wives, their offspring, and their sires, and that it would be more just if all were alike subjected to the common misery, so that a similarity of position might give occasion for the unanimity of resolution. But at the very moment that His Eminence saw his measure beginning to bear fruit, and was applauding himself for having adopted it, an inhabitant of Rochelle who had arrived from Portsmouth managed to pass through the royal lines. God knows how, so complete was the threefold watchfulness of Bassompierre, Schomberg, and the Duke of Angoulême, themselves overlooked by the cardinal, and announced that he had seen a splendid fleet ready to set sail before another week. Buckingham, moreover, declared to the mayor that the great league against France was at last about to be proclaimed, and that the kingdom would be speedily invaded, at the same time, by the armies of England, Spain, and the Empire. This letter was publicly read in all parts of the town, copies of it were posted at the corners of the streets, and even those who had attempted to commence negotiations interrupted them with a resolution to wait for the succor which was so soon to reach them. This unexpected circumstance renewed all the original anxieties of Richelieu, and compelled him to turn his eyes once more across the sea. During all this time, the royal army, free from the inquietude of its one true commander, led a most joyous life, for provisions were not scarce in the camp, or money either. The regiments were all at rivalry in gaiety and audacity, to take spies and to hang them, to undertake the daring expeditions on the mole or the sea, to imagine follies and to execute them calmly. Such were the pastimes which made those days seem short to the army, while they were long not only for the Rochellois, who were worried by famine and anxieties, but for the cardinal, who blockaded them so vigorously. Sometimes, when the cardinal, who was always riding about like the humblest soldier of the army, directed his thoughtful eyes over the works which advanced so slowly in comparison to his desires, although constructed by engineers whom he had recruited from the remotest corners of France, if he met with a musketeer of M. de Treville's company, if he approached him and looked at him in a singular way, and then, not recognizing him as one of our four companions, he transferred to other objects his penetrating glance and his vast thoughts. One day, when consumed by a moral lassitude of mind, without hopes of treating with the Rochellois, and without intelligence from England, the cardinal went forth, with no other aim but that of going out, and only accompanied by Cahusac and La Houdinière, wandering along the sands and mingling the immensity of his own dreams with the immensity of the ocean. He came at a gentle pace to a small hill, from the top of which he perceived behind a hedge reclining on the grass, and protected from the sun by a clump of trees, 7 men surrounded by empty bottles. 4 of these men were our musketeers, getting ready to listen to the reading of a letter which one of them had just received. This letter was so important that it had made them desert some cards and dice which they had left upon a drum. The three others were the valets of the gentleman, and were at the moment engaged in opening an enormous demijohn of Collier wine. The cardinal, as we have said, was in a gloomy mood, and when he was in this state of mind, nothing so much increased his sullenness as the gaiety of others. He had, besides, a singular habit of always supposing that the circumstances which caused his sadness were those which excited the gaiety of strangers. Making a sign to Cahusac and La Houdinière to halt, he got off his horse, and approached these suspicious laughters, hoping, by the aid of the sand, which deadened the sound of his steps, and of the hedge which concealed his person, to hear some words of a conversation which appeared so interesting. At 10 paces from the hedge he recognized the Gascon dialect of D'Artagnan, and as he had already seen that these men were musketeers, he did not doubt that the three others were those who were called the Inseparables, that is to say, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. It may be imagined that this discovery increased his desire of hearing the conversation. His eyes assumed a strange expression, and with the stealth tread of a tiger-cat, he approached the hedge, but he had been only able to catch a few vague syllables, having no definite meaning, when a sonorous and brief exclamation made him start, and attracted the attention of the musketeers. "Officer," called out Grimaud. "You are speaking, I think, rascal," said Athos, raising himself on one elbow, and fascinating Grimaud with his sparkling eye. Grimaud, therefore, did not add one word, contenting himself with pointing with his finger toward the hedge, and indicating by this gesture the cardinal and his escort. The 4 musketeers were on their feet with one bound, and bowed respectfully. The cardinal appeared furious. "It seems that the gentlemen of the musketeers have themselves guarded," said he. "Is it because the English are expected by land, or do the musketeers regard themselves as superior officers?" "My lord," replied Athos, for in the midst of the general confusion he alone had preserved that coolness and calmness of the nobleman which never failed him, "my lord, the musketeers, when their duty is as ended, or when they are off duty, play and drink, and are very superior officers to their own servants." "Their servants," growled out the cardinal, "servants who had a watchword to warn their masters when anyone approaches. They are not servants, they're sentinels. Your eminence may, however, perceive that we had not taken this precaution. Then we should have run the hazard of permitting you to pass without paying our respects, and without offering our thanks to you for uniting D'Artagnan and ourselves," continued Athos. "You, D'Artagnan, who were but now wishing for an opportunity of expressing your gratitude to his eminence, here is one given to you. Take advantage of it." These words were uttered with that imperturbable coolness which distinguished Athos in times of danger, and with that excessive politeness which made him, on certain occasions, a king more dignified than kings by birth. D'Artagnan came forward and stammered out some words of thanks, which quickly died away before the severe gaze of the cardinal. "It does not signify, gentlemen," continued the cardinal, without appearing in the slightest degree turned from his first intention by the incident which Athos had suggested. "It does not signify. I do not like simple soldiers, because they have the advantage of serving in a privileged regiment to play the great man. Discipline is the same for all." Athos allowed the cardinal to finish his sentence, and bowing assent, thus replied, "Discipline, my lord, has been, I hope, in no degree forgotten by us. We are not on duty, and we believed that, not being on duty, we might dispose of our time precisely as we pleased. If it should fortunately happen that your eminence has some special orders to give us, we are ready to obey them. Your lordship perceives," continued Athos, frowning, for this species of interrogatory began to irritate him, "that, to be ready at the least alarm, we have brought with us all our arms." He pointed with his finger to the 4 muskets stacked near the drum which bore the cards and dice. "Your eminence may believe," added D'Artagnan, "that we should have come to meet you, if we could have supposed that it was you who approached us with so small a retinue." The cardinal bit his mustaches and even his lips. "Do you know what you look like, always together as you now are, armed as you now are, and guarded by your valets?" said the cardinal. You look like 4 conspirators." "Oh, as to that, my lord," said Athos, "it is true, and we do conspire, as your eminence might have seen the other morning, only it is against the Rocheleois." "Ah, gentlemen politicians," replied the cardinal, frowning in his turn, "the secret of many things might be found in your brains if one could read in them, as you were reading in that letter which you concealed the moment you saw me coming." The color flew into the face of Athos, and he made one step toward his eminence. "It might be thought that you really do suspect us, my lord, and that we are undergoing a real examination. If that be the case, would your eminence deign to explain yourself, and we should at least know what we are to expect?" "And if it were an examination," replied the cardinal, "others besides you have been subjected to one, Monsieur Athos, and have answered. And therefore, my lord, have I said that your eminence has only to question, and that we're ready to reply." "What letter was that which you are reading, Monsieur Aramis, and which you concealed?" "A letter from a woman, my lord." "Oh, I understand," said the cardinal. "Discretion is necessary as to epistles of that kind, but nevertheless they may be shown to a confessor, and you know that I am in orders." "My lord," said Athos, with a calmness the more fearful that he slightly moved his head whilst making this answer, "my lord, the letter is from a woman, but it is not signed either by Marion de Lorme, or by Madame de Combalet, or Madame de Chaulnes." The cardinal became as pale as death. A savage flash was emitted from his eyes. He turned about as if to give an order to Cahusac and La Houdinière. Athos saw the movement and took a step toward the muskets, on which the eyes of his 3 friends were fixed, like those of men who are not inclined to allow themselves to be arrested. The cardinal was himself only the 3rd man of his party. The musketeers, including their valets, were 7. He judged also that the game would still be more unequal if Athos and his friends were really conspiring, and by one of those rapid changes which he always had at command, all his anger melted into a smile. "Come, come," said he, "you're brave young men, proud in the sunshine, but faithful in the dark, and there's no great harm in keeping a good watch over yourselves, when you watch so well over others. Gentlemen, I have not forgotten that night when you served as my escort in going to the Red Dovecot. If there were any danger to be feared on the road I am about to take, I would beg you to accompany one. But as there is none, remain where you are and finish your wine, your game, and your letter. Adieu, gentlemen." And again mounting his horse, which Cahusac had brought him, he saluted them with his hand and went his way. The 4 young men, erect and motionless, followed him with their eyes, but without uttering a word until he was out of sight. Then they looked at each other. The countenance of all of them indicated consternation, for in spite of the amicable adieu of his eminence, they knew well that the cardinal had gone away with rage in his heart. Athos alone smiled with a haughty and disdainful smile. When the cardinal was out of reach of sound as well as out of sight, "That Grimaud called out very late," said Porthos, who had a great desire to vent his ill humor on someone. Grimaud was about to answer by excusing himself, when Athos raised his finger and Grimaud remained silent. "Would you have given up the letter, Aramis?" said D'Artagnan. "I had decided," said Aramis in the softest, most melodious voice, "that if he had persisted in requiring the letter, I would have presented it to him with one hand and passed my sword through his body with the other." "I expected as much," said Athos, "and that is the reason that I threw myself between you. Verily, that man is extremely imprudent to talk in such a style to other men. One would imagine that he had never been engaged with any but women and children." "My dear Athos," said D'Artagnan, "I admire you, but yet we were wrong after all." "How wrong?" said Athos. "Whose, then, is this air we breathe? Whose this ocean over which our looks extend? Whose is this land on which we were reclined? Whose is this letter from your mistress? Do all these belong to the cardinal? Upon my honor, this man fancies that the world belongs to him. There were you, stammering, stupefied, and overwhelmed as though the Bastille stared you in the face, and the gigantic Medusa had transformed you into stone. Is it a conspiracy, I wonder, to be in love? You are in love with a woman whom the cardinal has chosen to confine. Your wish to rescue her from his hands is a game which you are playing against his eminence. This letter is your hand. Why should you show your card to your adversary? If he can guess it, very good. We shall easily guess his, you may be assured. In fact, Athos, what you now say is full of sense, replied D'Artagnan. In that case, let us not say another word about what has just occurred, and let Aramis resume his cousin's letter, where the cardinal interrupted him. Aramis re-extracted the letter from his pocket, the three friends drew near him, and the three valets again grouped themselves around the capacious demijohn. You had only read 1 or 2 lines, said D'Artagnan. Begin over again at the very beginning. With pleasure, replied Aramis. My dear cousin, I really believe that I shall decide on going to Bethune, where my sister has made our little servant enter into a convent of the Carmelites. That poor child is quite resigned. She knows that she cannot live anywhere else without endangering her salvation. Nevertheless, if our family affairs should be settled as we wish, I think that she will run the danger of perdition, and will return to those whom she regrets, more particularly, as she knows that they are always thinking of her. In the meantime, she's not very unhappy. All that she now desires is a letter from her intended. I know very well that this sort of article has some difficulty in passing through the gratings. But after all, as I have proved to you, my dear cousin, I am not very unskillful, and I will undertake the commission. My sister thanks you for your good and enduring remembrance. She was for a short time in great anxiety, but she is at present more composed, having sent her agent down there, that nothing may happen unexpectedly. Adieu, my dear cousin. Let me hear from you as often as you can, that is to say, as often as you can safely. I embrace you. Marie Michon. Oh, what do I owe you, Aramis? Exclaimed D'Artagnan. Dear Constance, at last I have intelligence of her. She lives, she's in safety in a convent, she's at Bethune. And where is Bethune, Athos? On the frontiers of Artois and Flanders. When once the siege is raised, we may make a tour there. And it will not be long, it is to be hoped, said Porthos, for this morning they hung another spy who declared that the Rocheleois were now reduced to feed upon the uppers of their shoes. Supposing that, after having eaten the uppers, they should consume the sole, I do not exactly see what can remain for them afterwards unless they should take to eating one another. Poor fools, said Athos, emptying a glass of excellent Bordeaux, which, without possessing at the time the reputation that it now enjoys, did not the less deserve it. Poor fools, as if the Catholic faith were not the most profitable and the most agreeable of all religions. Yet never mind, added he, smacking his tongue against his palate. They're brave fellows. But what the plague are you doing, Aramis? Continued Athos. Are you putting that letter into your pocket? True, said D'Artagnan. Athos is right. It must be burned. And who knows even then but that the cardinal may have some secret for interrogating ashes? He must have one, said Athos. But what will you do with the letter? Inquired Porthos. Come here, Grimaud, said Athos. To punish you for having spoken without leave, my friend, you must eat this piece of paper. Then, to reward you for the service which you have rendered us, you shall afterwards drink this glass of wine. Here's the letter first. Chew it hard. Grimaud smiled, and with his eyes fixed upon the glass, which Athos filled to the very brim, chewed away at the paper and finally swallowed it. Bravo, Monsieur Grimaud, said Athos. And now take this. Good. I will dispense with your saying thank you. Grimaud silently swallowed the glass of Bordeaux, but during the whole time that this pleasant operation lasted, his eyes, which were fixed upon the heavens, spoke a language which, though mute, was not therefore the less expressive. And now, said Athos, unless the cardinal should form the ingenious idea of opening Grimaud's stomach, I believe that we may be pretty easy. During this time, his eminence pursued his melancholy way, murmuring under his mustaches, "Decidedly, these 4 men must belong to me."